Good morning, students. It's Miss Frederick here. This is for my adjustment psych class. We're covering Chapter 12, Development and Expression of Human Sexuality in the adjustment psych class. I was afraid I said adolescent again. Tendency to forget that the A words throw me off. Okay. Development and Expression of Human Sexuality. It's a long chapter. I'm trying to cover it in one video. Shouldn't take more than 2 hours, but it'll be available by 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, as per usual. Okay, so this is a controversial chapter. I'll try to cover it as maturely as possible, but it's just another thing that we need to talk about that's important. Becoming a sexual person. That's the first part of the chapter. We're going to talk about the learning objectives, identify the key aspects of sexual identity, explain how physiological factors influence sexual differentiation and maturation, understand how psychosocial factors influence aspects of sexuality such as attitudes and behavior, and explain gender differences in sexual socialization and how they affect individuals. Sexual identity, physiological factors, psychosocial factors, and gender differences. And honestly, guys, this is going to be a very illuminating chapter. Okay, becoming a sexual person. First part. Let's talk about sexual identity. It refers to the complex personal qualities, self-perceptions, attitudes, values, and preferences that guides one's sexual behavior. So first we need to talk about sexual orientation. Now they have 3 choices here. Oh, let's make it simple, shall we? 3 choices. Heterosexuals seek emotional or sexual relationships, emotional and sexual relationships with members of the other gender. That's heterosexuals. Seek relationships with members of the other gender. Homosexuals seek emotional sexual relationships with members of the same gender. So if you consider homosexual or heterosexual, you would choose emotional sexual relationships, not just sexual relationships. Many people want, have an emotional tie that goes with it. And bisexuals seek emotional sexual relationships with members of both genders. And yes, bisexuals are canon. It is the thing that we're going to talk about in here. Talk about body image. Body image has a lot to do with our sexual attitudes. Involves how one sees themselves physically and affects how one feels about themselves in the sexual domain. If you perceive yourself as more sexually attractive than others, it might affect how you deal with things and how you choose to seek out partners. The choices you make in that realm of your life. 1 second. Okay, let's talk about sexual values and ethics. We talked about sexual identity. We talked about sexual orientation, body image. Let's talk about sexual values and ethics. We all have different ethics regarding sex. Different things that we choose to engage in, why. So some people have absolutist sexual values, which consist of no sexual activity outside the marriage. So no sex before marriage, no sexual activity outside the marriage. I want to be exclusive to my husband or wife. Relativism. The relationship determines whether sexual activity is appropriate. And hedonism, which is anything goes. I guess that's a very simplistic term. So absolutism, no sexual activity outside the marriage. I don't know anything about, birth control or how that plays into it, but I know that that's pretty much what it is. Relativism, the type of relationship you're in, determines whether sexual activity is appropriate. And hedonism, which is anything goes. And of course, there's different erotic preferences, which can go into whatever it is you're into in that particular room of the house. Erotic preferences can go from different choices you make. And also there's a whole bunch of different literature you can look up when it comes to that sort of thing. Physiological influences. There's hormones and sexual differentiation. So, how do hormones affect our secondary sexual characteristics or primary sexual characteristics? During prenatal development, that's before you're born, the gonads produced androgens, or the male hormone, testosterone, causing masculinization of the genitals in the male fetus. In puberty, estrogens and androgens trigger maturation of sexual traits and organs in girls and boys respectively. Okay? So your body starts shooting estrogen and tends to exert sexual maturation. Menarche is the occurrence of menstruation, which is normally considered the onset of puberty in women. And women start bleeding. The vaginal lining starts sloughing off as a result of you not having a baby or having a zygote implanted. Spermarchy is considered the first ejaculation in males. Now bear in mind, guys, I'm going to be using very scientific terms, so I hope that doesn't throw any of you off. Hormones and sexual behavior. Hormones levels affect sex drive in many animals, humans included. People who have an overabundance of testosterone probably want to have sex more often. Whether or not they do that is up to them. So hormone levels affect sex drive in many animals. In humans, for both men and women, androgens affect sexual motivation. So testosterone affects whether or not you're motivated to have sex in men and in women. I know you think estrogen would do it, but no, it's actually testosterone. Higher levels of testosterone in women are also linked with higher rates of sexual activity. Bet you didn't see that coming. Let's talk about psychosocial influences. Again, our bodies are the only thing that determines how we want to have sex, right? There's also our social influences, what our family tells us is right, what our environment tells us is right. And again, if you take me for Psych 2, I go over like an entire part of the chapter which explains how cultural factors affect our relationship with sex. Okay? So families who punish innocent sexual exploration can socialize children to associate guilt and shame with sex. Children benefit from having positive and open conversations about sex with their parents. They have sex at a later age, less often, and have fewer partners. Now, that might have a correlational effect. I'm not sure if it's a causal one. I think that's typically really good advice. Just be open and be there, you know? When it comes to peers, I hate to put it to you so straight, but peers are often the primary source of information for teens regarding sex. Unfortunately, they can be a highly misleading source of information and often promote unhealthy sexual values. I apologize for my phone going off, guys. Normally it doesn't go off at 9:36 at night. So as of 2012, 21 states and DC mandated sex education in public schools. However, most offer only abstinence education. Abstinence only education. In other words, they don't teach you how to take care of yourself. They don't teach you how to wear a condom. They don't teach you about the risk of if you have sex. They don't teach you, say don't do it. Avoid doing it till you're ready. There's a lot of proof that that stuff don't work. Abstinence-only sex education does not work. It's not effective in reducing teen pregnancy. In contrast, comprehensive programs are associated with increased use of contraception, reduced pregnancies, and reduced high-risk behaviors. So offering comprehensive programs is important, but most people, especially this state, don't really talk about that. So there's another specific psychosocial influence that you're probably wondering why I didn't bring up yet. Religion. Religious teachings can dictate what is seen as sexually natural. Data from 3 national surveys show the main message teens get is don't have sex until marriage. Data also showed that virginity pledges are largely ineffective. Because many people take virginity pledges just to do that for their parents. They don't always do that for themselves. Again, I've never taken one. I've never worn a chastity ring. My friends are like, why didn't you do that? I'm like, because my relationship with sex is my relationship with sex. It's not anybody else's business, you know? And honestly, everyone's going to have a different relationship with sex, no matter who you are. And honestly, it doesn't need to be anybody else's business. So, that's my 2 cents on the matter. So basically, a lot of the main messages students get in a in a religious setting is don't have sex until marriage. So let's also talk about the media. And the media and the church often have very conflicting messages to say, don't they? The media such as TV, films, books, magazines, and the internet are all media sources that contain large volumes of sexual material, some extremely explicit. 16% of characters having sex on TV are teens or young adults. 16%. Not 60, 16, 1-6. So some sources do provide valuable information on sexual topics. So one must be highly selective. So the media can teach you stuff, but it also can provide you with very, very misleading information, depending on what's being covered and how it's being covered. Okay. So there's a percent of programs of various genres that depict any sexual content. Soap operas, 90%. Reality TV shows, 28%. So about 65% of programs depict sexual content. Okay, comedy series. Anyone who watches Friends knows that someone's sleeping with someone every episode. Sorry, but I watch Friends regularly. Drama series, 71. Movies about, I didn't expect it to be this high, but it's like 85% of movies depict sexual content. But soap operas so far are the highest. There is gender differences in sexual socialization. Society teaches us that men are more sexual than women. Lies. I know it sounds unprofessional me saying that, but it's not necessarily true. Might be true in some cases for different men and different women, but the differences are exaggerated. So some differences are men are slightly more likely to engage in casual sex. Some differences, and they are slightly more likely. 2, men are more likely to engage in masturbation. 3, men are more likely to use pornography. 4, men have sex more frequently and have more sex partners. 5, men are more permissive in their attitudes towards sex. 6, women are more likely to feel negative emotions such as shame, guilt, or fear in response to sex. So these are some of the differences that are given. So socialization may affect these differences, guys. It is not necessarily a gender thing. It's not a biologically based thing that occurs with this. Most of this occurs with socialization. People act poorly because they learn it from somewhere. Or sometimes they just learn bad behaviors all on their own. But, if a behavior sticks with you, that means they learned it from somewhere. So socialization may affect these differences by encouraging males to experiment sexually, to initiate sex, and to enjoy sex without emotional connection. So society also teaches girls to view sex in the context of a loving relationship. And it fosters conquest orientation in males. Oh, I've slept with this girl, and it's amazing. Like, I'm hearing that I hear that sometimes, like, it'll often be told in an exaggerated way if guys hang out together. suggests the importance of physical attractiveness in catching a mate in females. If you want to catch a mate, you gotta take care of, you gotta look a certain way, you gotta look a certain way. How often do we see this in movies? The girl only gets the guy after she puts on the makeup or wears a short skirt. I don't know, guys. I like romantic comedies as much as the next person. I do. But when I watch these movies, I do look at the messages with an extreme grain of salt. So sometimes it emphasizes negative associations girls have with sex, pain, guilt, shame, and fear of pregnancy. So sometimes women are taught, and rightly so. It's right that women should take proper precautions. But sometimes the negative associations girls have with sex can be emphasized from socialization. It's important to be cautious. But again, a lot of the differences between men and women's sexualities have been exaggerated or the result of socialization rather than genetics or what we're born with. So there is actually a lot of data that suggests that women and men want sex roughly the same amount. So basically the same amount. So again, kind of be aware of this. Okay, so we're going to talk about sexual orientation now. We're going to start off with Kinsey, which is a little outdated, but he was a maverick in his time. And we're going to contrast that with Diamond's theory of sexual fluidity. I'm going to summarize the current thinking on the origins of sexual orientation. We're going to describe contemporary attitudes on homosexuality and explain the process of disclosing one's sexual orientation and the adjustment of lesbians and gay males. And we're going to spend a lot of time emphasizing that fourth sentence. Let's talk about sexual orientation. Key considerations. Most people view sexuality and homosexuality as two distinct categories. That's how we're socialized. But it's more accurate to view them as endpoints on a 7-point scale. If you look at it more like a spectrum, this sort of thing starts to make more sense. Lisa Diamond describes sexuality in terms of sexual fluidity, or the idea that sexual attraction can change based on the context and situational factors. So, in this case, the 6-point scale is 0, exclusively heterosexual, 1, predominantly heterosexual, only incidentally homosexual, 2, like saying, oh, they consider themselves heterosexual, but they fell for a member of the same sex. 2, predominantly heterosexual, more than incidentally homosexual. 3, equally heterosexual and homosexual, that might be considered your bisexual individuals. I think, honestly, bisexuality might range a little bit into the 2 and the 1 category. 4, predominantly heterosexual, more than incidentally homosexual. 5, predominantly homosexual, only incidentally heterosexual. And 6, exclusively homosexual. Again, I'm not going to make you guys know this. I just want you to kind of be exposed to it. Okay, let's talk about sexual orientation's origins. Why, how do we first learn to do our research on this? What made this a point of our research? Why are we interested in talking about this? Freud attributed homosexuality to an unresolved Oedipus complex. In other words, when the child was around the age of 5, they didn't start identifying with the same-sex parent, which the child identifies with the parent of the opposite gender. So the child identifies with the opposite gender rather than the parent that has the same gender as them, which is how, according to Freud, this was supposed to happen. Again, they didn't know much about homosexuality back then. Sociologists suggest when it is caused by poor relationships with same-gender peers or from childhood labels of homosexual. There is little support from either of those views. Being teased for being gay or being suspected to be gay does not make you gay. Okay? People who have bad relationships with same-gender peers aren't necessarily going to be gay. So many gay men and women trace homosexual leanings to early childhood. That's true. Many people find out before the age of 10 whether or not they're gay, bi, straight, whatever. Many people, they kind of tell that, oh, well, they start having crushes or start becoming fixated. I mean, you can kind of tell from a young age. So many theorists propose that sexual orientation is more likely caused by biological factors, especially since it starts so young. I'm just saying what the literature is saying. One prominent biological explanation attributes homosexuality to prenatal exposure to sex hormones that alter the organization of the fetal brain. So again, hormones in prenatal development before the baby is born alter someone's sexual orientation. Genetic factors are also potential contributors and are supported in part by twin studies. As in, they separate two twins and they look at the genetics of each one. However, the fact is, it is still largely unknown which factors determine sexual orientation. They're leaning towards the genes, but they're not sure. And I think there's a whole bunch of different things that can cause sexual orientation. Part of the reason why they might have a hard time figuring this out is because sexuality is fluid across the lifetime. I have issues with that. I have issues finding hard data on that. So, identical twins, as you know, have 100% genetic relatedness. Okay? So, the males have over 50% of relatives with gay sexual orientation, and the females had about 48%. So, there's a higher contributing factor in identical twins than is for like adoptive siblings or fraternal twins. Adoptive siblings have about 10% to like 5%. So again, genetics has a greater influence on it according to the chart than, you know, just living with someone or being around it. So that adds credence to the fact that living with someone who is gay will not make you yourself gay. And being friends with someone who is gay will not make you yourself gay. Environmental influence has less to do with it than you might think. So, although most people are accepting of those who are homosexual, some people do display homophobia or the intense fear and intolerance of homosexuals. Homophobia can look a whole bunch of different ways. It could be very subtle, like we mentioned before, about discrimination, or it could be very overt. Homophobia can translate into violence, and yes, this is very true, and I want you guys to be aware of this. Homophobia can translate into violence, and it often does. People have been beaten up and killed for being gay or anywhere on the LGBT spectrum. So in 2010, 18.6 of reported hate crimes were against homosexuals. Don't cry on camera, dang. Okay, in a national survey, 23% of LGBT participants, that's lesbian, gay, and bi participants, have been threatened with violence, and 49% reported verbal harassment. 49%. That's almost half. Gay males experience greater prejudice. Pay attention to this. Pay attention to this because it goes back to what we were saying about gender earlier, a couple chapters ago. Okay, being masculine is considered good, or being male-like is considered good, and being female-like is considered bad. So gay males experience more prejudice. If you know a guy who's gay, I don't care what culture you live in, do not out that person. Okay, so 35% for violence and 63% for verbal harassment. Gay males do receive more prejudice than gay females do. So, just letting you guys know, It's important to let people come out in their own time. Okay? Because you never know what environment they live in. So, this type of sexual violence on the part of the offender has been associated with being older, being male, having a lower educational level, living in the South or Midwest or in rural areas, or having conservative religious or political beliefs. I know you're probably thinking I'm reading this off of Reddit right now, aren't you? But this is literally what the literature is telling us. So if you are an offender of homophobia, a homophobic offender, it's associated with being older, male, lower education level, living in the South and Midwest or in rural areas, and having conservative religious and political beliefs. Now, none of those things necessarily make you homophobic, but it is associated with it. Again, correlation and causation, not the same thing. Okay, this is going to be a hard part of the chapter for me to get through. Disclosing one's sexual orientation. Again, let people do it in their own time. Do not out them. Okay? Because violence is a main thing that a lot of males have to deal with. Sexual identity involves acknowledging, recognizing, and labeling one's sexual orientation. Okay? One must also conceptualize it in positive terms. Recent generations are becoming aware of and are disclosing gay, lesbian, and bisexual identities earlier in life instead of hiding it. In deciding to disclose, one must weigh the benefits of being honest and social support. In certain cultures, especially traditional cultures, it's very hard to come out as lesbian or gay. But again, guys have it worse than girls do, so just be cognizant of that. So being honest or having social support. Some people choose not to come out or selectively come out to certain people. If you come out to a certain person and you say, I do not want this getting out, make sure that person knows. But still, never out somebody. Ever. But many people in that situation have to weigh the cost and benefits. Do I want to be honest, just stick being honest, or do I want to risk losing people? And do I want to have more social support in that area? Do I want to have more social support? Do I want to have the people rally behind me? Because sometimes you come out as gay, you can form a community with other people, who suffer or go through the same things you do. So there are potential costs, losing friends, being fired, and yes, even though it is legal to get married, if you are gay, you're still not going to be free from discrimination. You can still file a report on it, but it might be harder to get justice for that sort of thing. There's people who are gay who have been denied housing. Okay, they might fall victim to a hate crime. And yes, it is still possible, even with what happened in 2015, it is still possible to lose custody of your kids if you come out as gay. So again, I mean, some people are different. Some people don't lose custody of their kids. It just depends on the situation. And I don't think it's likely, but you want to make sure you're aware of your P's and Q's in that situation. Make sure, you make notes, make sure you write down everything, every interaction you have with the person. It's very important to stay and write down everything that goes on if you think you're being discriminated against. So when it comes to adjustment, gays and straights do not differ on overall measures of psychological adjustment, and being gay is not associated with any psychopathology. Until the 70s, it was considered It was considered a mental illness to be gay. It was even in the DSM. And I mean, we don't talk about this anymore, but we really need to. We really need to. Because at one point in history, being gay was considered mentally ill, and you were supposed to take medication to deal with it. And that was considered the lighter option, which had to do with it's either being gay or get locked up for some people. So again, I want you to be aware of this, the fact that we're still got a long way to go. When it comes to ending homophobia. We got a long way to go. Is it going to happen overnight? No, it's not. But it's something we're going to have to fight from within the system and without it. Homosexuals are more likely to be exposed to sexual prejudice and discrimination, and are at greater risk for anxiety, depression, and substance abuse and suicide attempts because of whatever it is they're dealing with at the time. It could be being gay doesn't make them go through that. It's being gay and it coming out, being exposed, being made fun of, being ridiculed, having a hard time getting a job, things like that. And yes, there are ways of dealing with discrimination you might feel, but it's very important to be mindful of the P's and Q's, and write everything down and make sure you know who you talk to and when, and sometimes it's good to, have a lawyer on hand, but just to be real with you guys, I'm just saying that discrimination is still a reality of the world that we live in. Let's talk about the human sexual response. Okay? There's 4 phases of the human sexual response cycle. We're going to discuss the gender differences and patterns of orgasm and give some reasons for them. Again, we're going to switch turns, and we're going to turn from social issues. We're going to become very, very scientific now. I'm going to use very proper terms. Scientific terms. Let's see if I can bring this up. Okay. The sexual response cycle typically takes 4 phases in men and in women. During sex, one typically experiences one of the 4 of the phases in reaction. So we'll start with the excitement phase. Arousal increases rapidly. Vasocongestion, which is engorgement in the blood vessels, causes penile erections. Swelling of the testes, movement in the scrotum closer to the body. Swelling of the clitoris and labia, vaginal lubrication, and enlargement of the uterus. Now, for men and women have different patterns, obviously. Over time, they might, women are more known to have multiple orgasms over a time period. And depending upon, how that happens, it's different for every woman and every man. There's no set, predictable way you can expect sex to go. The plateau phase is when arousal keeps building, which typically is slower for women. In females, the lower third of the vagina tightens, the upper third balloons, cervix and uterus are lifted up and away. In males, the gland swells, the testicles enlarge and move closer to the body, and pre-ejaculatory fluid is excreted. This fluid may contain sperm. Be aware of this. Okay? Those are things that most people think, oh, you can't get pregnant from pre-cum. Yeah, you can. And just kind of be aware of that. The orgasm phase is the 3rd phase. It occurs when sexual arousal reaches its peak intensity and is discharged in a series of muscular contractions that pulsate through the pelvic area. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiration increase, accompanied by an intensely pleasurable feeling of release. In males and some females, ejaculation can occur. Yes, women can ejaculate too. That is part of that you may not know. Resolution phase is the fourth one. Arousal subsides and physiological responses return to normal. After orgasm, the males usually experience a refractory period, a time largely following orgasm which males are largely unresponsive to further stimulation. Resolution is slower for females. So you might experience an orgasm fast and might come back quicker. Might be ready to go again afterwards. So at this point, during the refractory period, that normally typically happens after the orgasm, the male is largely unresponsive. So there's gender differences in the pattern of orgasm. I kind of alluded to this before. During intercourse, females are less likely to reach orgasm, as it does not provide direct stimulation of the clitoris. Women are more likely to orgasm following oral sex or the manual stimulation of the clitoris. Men are more likely to orgasm during sex that involves intercourse. Women are more likely to fake an orgasm, but they're also capable of multiple orgasms. I think it's because the refractory period is smaller. So again, sex works differently for men and women, depending on what the equipment is with, and not every woman is the same, and not every man is the same. It's about the same amount of variability in each. So that's the clinical definition, okay? Remember the 4 different stages. I can go all about this all day, but I want to stick to the slides. Sexual expression. There's 6 different forms of sexual expression. We're going to discuss the preferred sexual activities of gay males and lesbians and the common barriers in communicating about sex. In fact, I think that's the joke a lot of what is it? Sitcoms like to talk about. So people experience sexual pleasure in many ways. Again, not every person is different. Erogenous zones are areas of the body that are sexually sensitive or responsive. They don't have to be in the pelvic area either. The mind can be the most erogenous zone, as evidenced by the power of sexual fantasies. It's true. The mental aspect of sex is just as important as the physical one, if not more so. Around 90% of men and 80% of women are reported having sexual fantasies of someone other than their current partner. Again, 90% of men and 80% of women. Women's fantasies tend to be romantic. Men's are more visually explicit. I'm not going to give an explanation as to why. So most sexual encounters begin with kissing and touching. Increased levels of kissing is associated with less perceived stress and more relationship satisfaction. So it's kind of part of it. It's kind of like part of the trust aspect of it, I suppose. Self-stimulation is commonly referred to as masturbation. Though once shunned as harmful as to physical and mental health, self-stimulation is now seen as a normal and healthy part of sexuality. I think a lot of that has to do with the work of Kellogg. And there are also people who were the original proponents of, what is it? Not genital mutilation, but not castration, I'm sorry, circumcision. Thought that it would stop them from masturbating. Stop young boys from masturbating. I'm just like, this is what I'm seeing and hearing, but I understand the mentality behind it, but I guess that shows how lack of being able to talk about sex in society has a lot to do with our lack of knowledge about it and our beliefs in old wives' tales, because we're unafraid to talk about the science of it. So self-stimulation is a common sexual behavior. 94% of men and 85% of women have masturbated at least once. So recent studies show that 46% of women reported using a vibrator during masturbation, and women's use of vibrators for self-stimulation is associated with more positive sexual functioning and better sexual health practices. So you're more likely to do things like use a condom and things like that. And, maybe take birth control or choose better partners if you if you use a vibrator. So that is associated. So correlation does not necessarily imply causation. People who use vibrators are often more likely to take better care of their sexual health. Okay, so we have oral and anal sex. Cunnilingus is oral stimulation of the female genitals, and fellatio is oral stimulation of the penis. Oral sex is a major source of orgasms in many heterosexual couples, and is the main source for homosexual couples. A positive effect of oral sex is that it does not result in pregnancy. However, you can still get an STD from oral sex, whether or not you're performing fellatio on a man or cunnilingus on a woman or a person who has a vagina. Let's see. Okay. Anal intercourse involves insertion of the penis into the partner's anus and rectum. 27% of men and 22% of women report having had anal intercourse in the past year, but it's more popular among homosexual male couples. Anal sex is risky because rectal tissues can easily tear, increasing the likelihood of HIV transmission. There's this amount of truth to that, because while you can be straight and have anal intercourse as well, it is considered very risky because the skin down there is very thin. There's a lot of concentration of blood vessels in the anal area, so you're more likely to get anal or rectal bleeding. But again, if you guys need me to post resources, I can do that, but there is a lot of resources on the internet that explain how to have it without hurting yourself. Again, just make sure you read a lot of research before you engage in something you've never done before. Intercourse, which is otherwise known as coitus or vaginal intercourse, involves inserting the penis into the vagina and typically pelvic thrusting. Intercourse is the most widely practiced sexual act in our society. A variety of positions can be used, however, it's important to communicate with your partner about your preferences. Again, the most important aspect of this is the mind and the communication. If you don't feel secure with your partner emotionally, it will come out in terms of sexual behavior. So try to be as direct as possible. Don't hints. Say something like be as direct as possible. Let the other person know how you feel. As typically, direct communication is typically the best policy, straight talk. So though it's important, people are often reluctant to talk about sex because they're afraid of appearing ignorant. They're concerned about their partner's response. And they have conflicting attitudes about sex. Again, can you really blame them, given the fact that we get such conflicting information and we're afraid to talk about it? It's okay for us to make jokes about it, and spread, old wives' tales about it, but it's not okay to actually talk about, what actually goes on, the actual risks, and the actual problems that we're facing. So, communicating about sex specifically as to one's personal sex life and just communicating about the issues in general is typically hard for someone to do. Some people just don't care. Like me, I'm just focusing on the science of this. It makes more sense to me that way. So most people are afraid of appearing ignorant. I had a student ask me about the AIDS epidemic and how that related to people who were gay. And I explained that AIDS is not a bad person's disease. But it was moralized in the 80s and 90s as a bad person's disease because it resulted so many people who were homosexual had gotten it. But not only homosexuals had got it. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different things we can talk about, which we're probably going to discuss later on in the chapter. But I think all this kind of comes together and kind of makes it a very difficult conversation to have. Talk about patterns of sexual behavior. We outline the current research on sex as outside of and as well as within committed relationships. Compare and contrast sexual behavior in married committed heterosexual couples versus committed homosexual couples. We discuss the evidence on infidelity in committed relationships, and describe the spotlight on research providing the role of oxytocin in promoting fidelity. So sex outside of a relationship, we may have heard the term hookup culture before. It involves two strangers or briefly acquainted people having a single sexual encounter. Between 50 or 55% of college students report having at least one hookup experience. When they involve sex, 29% of women reported hooking up with someone they knew less than 24 hours with no regret. Men are more comfortable with hooking up than women, however. Might be a nurture thing there. Depends upon, how they're socialized. Friends with benefits refers to someone who friends who have sex but are not romantically involved, or at least they say that they're not. It is different from hooking up because a friendship is maintained. Or you think so, I don't know. There's different relationships or different attitudes toward friends with benefits, but in the case of that dalliance, someone ends up getting their feelings hurt. So around 54% of young men and 40% of young women have reported having a friends with benefits. Sex in committed relationships, sex between dating partners. Between men, sexual satisfaction is correlated with relationship stability. For women, relationship satisfaction is a better predictor of relationship stability. So it differs for men and women. I apologize if you can hear my pug snoring, by the way. So when it comes to marital sex, frequency of sex varies greatly in married couples. The majority reporting having sex between 2 and 3 times a week to once a month. Frequency tends to decrease as couples age for various reasons, but older couples remain capable of having enjoyable sex. We just don't talk about it in the media because it doesn't sell as well, I suppose. I don't know. We just probably haven't heard of it as much. So, let's see. For women, 37% have a few times per month or weekly. 38% say they have sex. 30% of men said they have sex a few times per month or weekly. So less than 4% of women report having sex more than 3 times a week, and 6% of men report having sex more than 3 times per week. So it's not as common. So sex in homosexual relationships tends to differ. Again, there's similar amounts of variability. If you're in a homosexual couple, you're going to have a lot of the same problems with intimacy or otherwise than if you were in a straight couple, in a heterosexual couple. There are 3 patterns of sexual frequency in homosexual relationships. There's a general decline in the frequency of sexual behavior over time. 1. 2. Earlier in the relationship, gay males engage in sex more frequently than do other couples. 3. Lesbian couples have sex less often than other couples. Sexual satisfaction is linked to the relationship. So it's not just common to straight people, it's common to people who are in a homosexual relationship as well. So, as with heterosexual couples, sexual satisfaction is linked with relationship quality. Gay male couples are more likely to embrace casual sex outside of the relationship, and lesbian couples generally have sex less frequently. When it comes to infidelity in committed relationships, in married couples, infidelity is termed adultery, or extramarital sex, whereas in unmarried committed couples, it is referred to as extradietic sex. As a side note, I wanted to mention I actually was looking online for different books, and for some reason they thought it was funny to post a book called How to Date a Married Man. There's actually books on this. I had a hard time looking at that. I was hoping that the inside of the book would be just one line, be married to him. So most people view extramarital sex as wrong. However, some couples have consensual extramarital sex with open marriages or polyamory. Now you can be polyamorous without actually being in a relationship too. My opinions on polyamory, I don't know a lot of the details on it, but I do know it's a thing that people report engaging in and people report having a lot of satisfaction in. So I suggest we look at the literature on that before we make a decision as to what's bad or good in this case. Let's talk about the prevalence of infidelity. Recent surveys suggest that approximately 21% of men and 11% of women admitted to infidelity. Around 20% of 1,300 undergraduates in one study admitted to extramarital oral sex or intercourse. This is like, let me see. So this is when you're engaging in sex outside of a committed relationship. Extramarital sex is most common of all among committed gay male relationships, however. So I refer to extramarital sex, I'm referring to infidelity in unmarried committed couples. For some reason, it's reported as most common of all among committed gay male relationships. So why are people unfaithful? People are unfaithful because of dissatisfaction with a relationship or anger toward a partner, boredom, need to confirm that one is still desirable, and strong attraction to another person. Men are usually motivated by sexual variety, while women seek an emotional connection. Again, not true of every man, not true of every woman. It's just usually. Impact. Approximately 20% of divorces are caused by infidelity. Men tend to react with anger and violence, women with sadness and need for support. In addition, people who engage in extramarital sex may experience loss of self-respect or guilt, stress, and complications from STDs. So there's different practical issues in sexual activity we need to discuss. We're identifying constraints on effective contraception and discussing the merits of hormone-based contraceptives and male condoms. Describing the various types of STDs and discussing their prevalence and listing some suggestions for safer sexual practices. So contraception, there are constraints on effective contraception. Couples must define themselves as sexually active. That's one of the reasons why some people don't use contraception. They don't get a condom because they don't consider themselves sexually active. They must have knowledge about fertility and conception. They've chosen method of contraception must be readily available. They must have the motivation and skill to use it correctly and consistently. Many people don't put on a condom correctly, or they don't take their birth control at the same time every day. It might cause a slip up. But again, there's also barrier-based contraception, there's hormone-based contraception. Only 2/3 of sexually active females aged 15 to 19 use contraception. Why so few? Some, I guess, might be partially due to absent-only sex education. Some of them underestimate their risk. Using contraception makes them feel guilty about planning to have sex. Males delegate this responsibility to females who may be reluctant to take charge. And use of alcohol impairs judgment. If you take me for intro to psych, we have this part of the chapter where we talk about how sex makes you more willing, like alcohol might make you more willing to have sex, but or might make you might take the edge off the nerves, but it impairs judgment. It also makes you less likely to be able to perform during sex. So let's talk about selecting a contraceptive method. So there's a variety of methods available, so don't think that there's only one available to you. But there's a whole bunch of different things that will affect whether or not you can use a certain type of contraception. Hormone-based contraception methods work by suppressing ovulation in women. So basically tricks your body to believing it's pregnant. However, they do not prevent STDs. So if you take a birth control pill, hormonal birth control pill like Kelnor, and there's another, I think that's an off-brand of an actual one, but there's a whole bunch of different types. But it doesn't prevent STDs. Why? Because you might still be having sex with someone who has an STD. Condom prevents semen from entering the vagina, but they are not very reliable, and latex condoms should never be used with oil-based creams and lotions. So if you use an oil-based creams and lotion, it might break down the latex involved, so you be careful with that. And check to make sure the silicone-based lube is, or with this water-based or silicone-based, whatever it is you're working with. Make sure you check it. And worst case scenario, just ask your pharmacist if you don't know. But again, condoms should not be used with oil-based creams and lotions. You can also buy condoms with lube inside them. Depends on how you do that. So, in female sterilization, tubal ligation is considered a contraceptive method. However, I'm going to be real with you ladies and gentlemen. If you undergo female sterilization, or if you want to undergo female sterilization, it's going to be hard to find a doctor who will do that in this state. I don't know why. I'm sure there's a legal ramification behind it, and it comes off as extremely sexist, but again, female sterilization is when women basically they have their tubes tied essentially, or they don't have your eggs removed, but you're unable to produce an egg. Okay, unable to produce an egg for fertilization. You can still get an STD though. This is effective permanently, doesn't interfere with sexual activity, and reduces the risk of ovarian cancer. Those are the advantages of tubal ligation. Side effects, of course, of surgery doesn't protect against STDs and is expensive as all get out, and it is, of course, irreversible, unlike male sterilization, which is a vasectomy. A vasectomy is effective, permanent, and doesn't interfere with sexual activity. Side effects associated with surgery doesn't prevent against STDs. Again, it's expensive, and according to this, it is irreversible. I've heard different literature on that, but again, if anyone's interested in that, check with your doctor to be sure. It says here that it's irreversible. I hear different things from different people. I guess it depends upon the vasectomy you have. But yeah, let's treat it right now as if it was irreversible. Again, check with your doctor. Withdrawal method of sex, basically that means I'm trying to explain this using only scientific terms. The withdrawal method of sex involves pulling the penis out before ejaculation. Remember how I mentioned earlier how you can still get pregnant from pre-cum? Yeah, so people think it's no-cost health risks. Guys, the withdrawal method is not effective. Okay, it might, if we're lucky, it reduces your chances by a small percentage, but even then, because pre-cum still contains sperm. So while this reduces sexual pleasure, it requires high motivation, and again, no protection against STDs. And of course, no contraception. Has no immediate monetary cost, but a high risk of pregnancy and STDs. So again, it's important to get checked regularly. So when it comes to emergency contraception, most people don't talk about this. Emergency contraception. Sometimes contraception fails or sexual activity occurs that is unplanned for, whereas forced sexual activity, you all know that is rape, or an emergency contraception is needed. Okay? In this case, you can take a pill called a Plan B, which is otherwise known as the morning after pill, which is available from pharmacies. Ow! They're 89% effective in preventing a pregnancy from occurring if taken within 72 hours of unprotected sex. So let's say you have protected sex and the condom breaks. And so you have sperm loose in your vagina. And this is for women, okay? So you can prevent this from happening. You can prevent pregnancy from happening with an 89% success rate by taking a morning after pill. What happens, it prevents ovulation by starting your period. I'm going to warn you, ladies, it's not a comfortable experience. Okay, it's actually very uncomfortable. So, I mean, some people choose to do it. I wouldn't say it's painful. I just would say it's very uncomfortable. So again, weigh your options. But I think considering unplanned pregnancy versus, a little bit of discomfort, most people choose the discomfort. It is entirely up to you as to how you choose to handle that. Of course, some people choose, for some reason, I think they're kind of cutting off the concept of condoms in here. For some reason, I don't think the slides cover that. Condoms are typically 80% effective, and most hormonal birth controls about 90% effective. Again, read what's on the box. Read what's on the box. It's very important to be an effective consumer. You don't want to just say, oh, I know condoms are 90% effective, I'm going to buy them without looking at them. Depends on the type of condom you use, the other types of protection you use. The best way to not get pregnant and not get an STD is to not have sex. And if you do contract an STD, it's not necessarily your fault. There's a whole bunch of stigmas associated with it. But I mean, anyone can contract that. You can get it from multiple different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be direct sexual contact. But STDs are diseases or infections that are transmitted primarily through sexual conduct. It's very difficult to get it any other way, but it can happen. Prevalence and transmission. Most infections occur in people under age 25. 25% of people contract an STD by age 21. So a special concern is the increase in HIV infections in heterosexuals and homosexuals too, especially women of color, especially those who may have husbands on the down low. I'm reading off the slide at this point. I'm not gonna, go into that. HIV infections are increasing in young, gay, and bisexual men of color. There might be a majority of reasons for that, but again, there was a whole movement about this in the 80s. 80s, 90s, and it got really, really bad. Because this disease, which came from certain parts of Africa, I think it's a blood infection. It can be transmitted via blood, use of a needle, or through sexual contact. You can't get AIDS by hugging someone or standing near a person. But it is increasing, the infections are increasing in young gay and bisexual men of color. And it can happen a multitude of ways. So women are more likely to acquire an STD from any sexual encounter and are much more likely to suffer more long-term consequences such as chronic pelvic pain, infertility, and cervical cancer. That can be I'm not trying to scare you guys, I swear. I'm not trying to scare you guys. And also, if you have an STD, there are certain pills you can take to prevent the symptoms. So you're more likely to acquire an STD from any sexual encounter and much more likely to suffer more long-term consequences, such as chronic pelvic pain, infertility, and cervical cancer. But there is now a vaccine for HPV for young boys and girls. Prevention points to remember: if not in a sexually exclusive relationship, always use latex condoms and spermicide. I support using latex condoms no matter what, because they're 80 to 80% likely, 85% likely to reduce likelihood of getting pregnant, especially if you want to have sex but you don't want to get pregnant. I'd recommend that. Use of condoms and spermicide and birth control is by far the most effective way to not get pregnant or get an STD if you want to have sex but you don't want to get pregnant. Outside of the concepts, outside of just abstinence, So people can be carriers of STDs without knowing it. Again, it's kind of like corona. And may not have any symptoms. The more sexual partners you have, the higher your risk of contracting an STD. It's like a numbers game. Okay? So again, just use your sense. Use your good sense. It's entirely up to you how you use to handle it, but those are just the tips you can use. Also, sometimes people think wearing multiple condoms makes a difference. Again, kind of be aware of that. Just kind of don't be afraid to ask your doctor these questions. 4, avoid sex with individuals who have had many previous partners. If you do, make sure you use protection yourself. Don't assume that labels people attach to themselves accurately describe all their sexual experiences. Someone might describe themselves as heterosexual, although they've never had sex with someone of the opposite sex. Some might describe themselves as bisexual, never had sex with anybody. It's just all about inclination. So labels do not necessarily indicate behaviors. They might indicate inclinations or tendencies more than they indicate actual behaviors. So you can say you're gay but never had sex with anyone of the same sex, or never had sex at all for that matter. So again, don't like, I'm not telling you guys not to hate, but I'm telling you guys don't prejudge based on that. So any activity that exposes you to blood or bodily fluids is risky. Again, drugs with needles. At-home piercings. There's a reason I go to parlors to get my piercings. I have most severe piercings, but I go to the parlors for that. I don't do that at home. No matter how tempting it is in this virus, I wanna get like an upper ear piercing, but that's probably the worst idea ever in this current climate. Oral genital sex may transmit HIV. Any type of people think, oh, oral sex isn't sex. I'm not sexually active. That's the problem with that. But you can still get HIV from any genital contact, or you can still get an STD from any genital contact. So be careful about that. Make sure you read, you do your research, you look at multiple sources if you have a special question, call your doctor. Don't just rely on what somebody tells you, unless that person's your doctor or medical professional. Again, watch for sores, rashes, or discharge. Now, discharge might include something like a yeast infection or a bladder infection. It may not necessarily mean that, but still, nothing wrong with getting tested. If you have cold sores, avoid kissing and oral sex, so be careful of that too. I know, it's like I just had to talk with you, but I swear that is what the slides have to say on that. And it's something that we do need to adjust, because a lot of people at our age, my age, and older still have misconceptions about sex, and I like to think I'm somewhat well informed. So, enhancing sexual relationships. List 5 general suggestions for enhancing sexual relationships. We're discussing the nature, prevalence, and causes of common sexual dysfunctions, as well as some strategies for coping with them. General suggestions about enhancing sexual relationships. 1. Become knowledgeable about sex. Again, like I said before, don't rely on what Susie Cream Cheese down the street tells you over coffee. Okay, don't rely on what you learn on Snapchat or whatever it is people doing these days, or Discord. Read. Okay, read up-to-date information. I'd recommend, if you want to learn about arousal, I'd recommend looking at Emily Nagoski's work. She has some really good work. You can talk to her. You can she has her own clientele and things like that. There's Scarletine. I hear that's a good website. A bunch of different ones you can look at. There's even some books at the library I found that's good use. Reviewing your sexual value system. That's important too. Look at what you value in a relationship, and kind of become cognizant of that. Learn to communicate about sex. Sometimes it means straight talk, being honest about what you want and what you need. Avoid focusing on sexual performance. And I don't think the chapter talks about this, but it's important that I at least mention that in a sexual relationship, people think orgasming is the goal. And that's not necessarily It's not necessarily the goal in every situation. Because focusing on orgasming only can sometimes detract from the sexual experience in and of itself. If you look at it as paying attention to your partner's wants and needs, whether or not you're in an exclusive or polyamorous relationship or casual relationship, it is important to do that. Again, you can learn about that stuff if you read Nagoski as well. If you focus purely on performance alone, you're not going to get as much out of it, or if a person does that in general. Number 5 is enjoy your sexual fantasies. Again, we all have desires and things that we look at. And again, there's different literature on that sort of thing that you can look at. If you need, I can give you a recommendation. Yeah. So again, there's different ways of looking at that. If you want to understand sexual dysfunctions, we have to first define them. Sexual dysfunctions are impairments in sexual functioning that cause subjective distress. Common culprits are physical factors like illness, medication, alcohol, and drugs. Yes, alcohol does inhibit sexual performance. Individual psychological factors like excessive guilt or anxiety. If you have guilt about sex, your chances are you're not going to enjoy it as much. Interpersonal factors like unresolved relationship issues. Unresolved relationship issues has a lot to do. Like if you're holding on to resentment, it might affect your performance. That's why it's important to address that in a relationship. So females report experiencing more pain during sex, or more cases of low arousal, more cases of lack of orgasm. In fact, 35% of females surveyed reported lack of orgasm, and women, almost 35% of females, reported lubrication difficulty. So I guess women tend to have more problems with sex than men do, but it depends upon the relationship. 4 common dysfunctions. The first one is erectile difficulties. When a man is persistently unable to achieve or maintain an erection adequate for intercourse. There might be many causes, but the most common culprit is anxiety about sexual performance. Premature ejaculation is when sexual relations are impaired because a man consistently reaches an orgasm too quickly. Stress has a lot to do with that. But sometimes guys don't always exert much effort to prolong intercourse. I don't feel comfortable about giving my own personal opinions about exerting too much effort to prolong intercourse, but there are different things you can look up if you're interested in that personal information yourself. Again, I definitely recommend the work of Nagoski for that. Emily Nagoski, she's a brilliant sexologist. Orgasmic difficulties is when people experience sexual arousal but have persistent problems in achieving an orgasm. That's more common than you'd think. The more common problem in women may occur occasionally, which is known as situational orgasmic difficulty, and chronically, generalized lifelong orgasmic difficulty. Women simply need more clitoral stimulation in order to achieve orgasm. You don't always get that from intercourse alone. Hypoactive sexual desire or lack of interest in sexual activity. In men, it's often related to embarrassment about erectile dysfunction. In women, it's more likely due to relationship difficulties. Again, there's nothing wrong with being ashamed or people who just don't like sex. Guys, there are people out there who just don't like sex at all. And they're known as people who are asexual, or they might be considered demisexual, depending on how you go. I'm not going to get into the technicalities, but there are people out there based on the hormones that they have in their bodies and just or life experiences. They may not just like sex at all. They just may not like it. And admittedly, it's hard to be in a relationship for a lot of people. It's hard to find other people who are ace. So it might be harder for them to find a relationship, but hypoactive sexual desire and asexuality are two completely different things. So I want to be aware that asexuality is a thing. Asexual people are valid. But there are people out there who don't like to have sex or are very, very extremely selective about it, more so than normal. So again, I just want to be aware there's a difference between having hypoactive sexual desire or asexuality. Hypoactive sexual desire is just a temporary lack of interest in sexual activity. Might be embarrassment about relationship dysfunction or relationship difficulties. This is very different from asexuality. So again, coping with specific problems. There's sex therapy, involving the professional treatment of sexual dysfunctions. Therapies may include medication or counseling and specific techniques from a qualified sex therapist. Medication is most common treatment for erectile dysfunction, like Viagra. Erectile dysfunction is caused by performance anxiety, or the one type of erectile dysfunction that's caused by performance anxiety can be treated with a technique called sensate focus, an exercise in which partners take turns pleasuring each other while giving guided verbal feedback, what certain kinds of stimulation are temporarily forbidden, in which certain kinds of stimulation are temporarily forbidden. So they change the way they have sex, essentially. And there's 2 treatments for premature ejaculation: the stop-start method and the squeeze technique. Stop-start method, the woman brings the man to the verge of orgasm and then stops. Squeeze technique, the woman brings the man to the verge of orgasm and then squeezes the end of the penis firmly for 3 to 5 seconds. Those are 2 treatments for premature ejaculation. And treating for orgasmic difficulty, which women usually involves counseling, which negative attitudes about sex are addressed, and women is encouraged to be more assertive in communicating her sexual needs to her partner. Since hypoactive sexual desire can stem from many factors, many people use a multifaceted counseling approach. So again, that's different from being asexual. Okay, someone's asexual. I mean, some people have offered to. They just don't get a lot out of sex. I mean, sometimes for some people, sex is just something that they do to please their partners, and that's it. And honestly, it must be very difficult to be asexual. So that's something that is there. So again, if you are asexual, there's nothing wrong with you. You are a valid individual as your own. And you shouldn't force yourself to be something that you're not. And again, I mentioned before how people who weren't straight were treated with hormones or jail at one point. And instead of, I think nowadays it should be something that should be sharply curtailed and prevented and almost entirely. But it is something that we have a history of doing. And many people were dying from the treatments. So I want you guys to be aware of that as part of the LGBTQ history. And I want you guys to just know that because we don't discuss that in our history books nowadays. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Honestly, as you can probably tell by the tone of my voice, some of this stuff was hard for me to mention or speak about. But I appreciate you sitting with me and sitting through it. Okay. So we are going to, I'm going to post the chapter questions and quiz, RQs in the quiz by tomorrow morning. So you'll have time to complete it. And yeah, if you guys want to set up a Zoom meeting with me and talk with me, that's fine. If you guys want to call my cell, you're welcome to do that. But you are always welcome to send me an email no matter what. Love you guys. Be safe out there.